Okay, now let's investigate a molecule that is actually both hydrophobic and hydrophilic all at the same time. So this is a really important molecule in biology, and it's called a phospholipid. So yes, it is a type of lipid. So it is mostly nonpolar. It has two fatty acid tails, just like the same fatty acid tails that you have in a triglyceride. So you have these two fatty acid tails. They are hydrophobic. They are nonpolar. This is most of the phospholipid. But then at the little teeny tiny top of the phospholipid, you have a phosphate group, which contains a lot of oxygens. And remember, oxygen is super electronegative, so it's going to give this little part of the phospholipid a polar region. So we call this the polar head of the phospholipid, and it is hydrophilic. So we call this phospholipid molecule amphiphilic because it's actually both hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So let's see in action some of the properties of these phospholipids. So here in this simulation, we have a number of phospholipids. The white sections here, these are the nonpolar fatty acid tails. And then the little blue and red part at the top, that's the polar head. So let's imagine we have a bunch of these phospholipids just hanging out in some water. And I'm going to start the simulation in a second, and you're going to see how they randomly move and interact with each other. And I want you to just think for a moment, what do you think is going to happen when I press start? Okay, let's see. Okay, so you can see as they're moving, so they have organized themselves into sort of this like spherical shape. This is called a micelle. And so all of the fatty acid tails have organized themselves into the center, and the polar phosphate heads are on the outside. That makes a lot of sense, right? Because the polar phosphate heads are attracted to water, so they're trying to move close to the water. And then these nonpolar fatty acid tails are afraid of water. They're hydrophobic, so they've sucked themselves to the inside to try to hide from that water. So this is what would happen in a water environment. This is what happens in your cells. But just for funsies, let's imagine what would happen in oil. So before I press start, I want you to think to yourself, what's going to happen when I press start on this simulation? Okay, let's see if you're right. Whoa, crazy. Yeah, there we go. So the micelle essentially flipped itself inside out, right? So now, since we're in oil, which is nonpolar, the nonpolar tails are on the outside, and then the polar phosphate heads are all on the inside. So once again, this is another example of nonpolar and nonpolar want to stick together, and polar want to stick together. There we go.